Welcome to the podcast today. And joining me today is Ari Weil from Akamai. And today is interesting because he's done a tremendous amount of research in the cloud industry. And today we're going to explore some of the key points that he found in his research regarding some tighter regulatory issues and the shift to customer demands related to public cloud, why 2025 could finally be the rise of a multi-cloud and edge computing environment, but more importantly, the growing need for AI driving the need for this distributed cloud infrastructure. So let's dive into it today. Welcome, Ari, and congrats on your Ohio State winning the national title.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, we were super excited, and I know the head coach is too because it got him his contract extension.
You know, I was a little worried after losing to Michigan that he was in trouble there. So it was good. Payback. Yeah, good
Well, I
stuff.
always say that Akamai has been like a full contact sport because there's so many people here from Michigan that actually some of their offices are like a shrine to that university. So it's always good to represent my Buckeyes.
Oh, that's perfect. Now, for those that don't know of you and Alkamine, do you mind talking over your role in Alkamine a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. So, Akamai is a company that has grown from being a pioneer in the CDN space to being a leader in application and network security to now really expanding what we do with the public cloud platform that's growing quickly. The underpinnings of everything that Akamai does is based on networking throughput and this massive distribution that we've established over 25 plus years. My role at the company is product marketing and strategy, go-to-market strategy. So I work with the teams on how do we best meet the market with our solutions? What's the best way basically to get customers to realize the benefits of the low latency experiences and the throughput that we enable for data in such a fast moving and, frankly, busy ecosystem of technology providers. So, helping them understand how to think about what they're trying to achieve and then helping them build towards that, that end state is really where we spend most of our time.
This is great because I mean, I think it's a hot topic, and especially when we look at 2025. Now, maybe we can start off with, one of the key points that I've seen you address is this new wave of what we call stricter regulations that are affecting the big public cloud providers. I mean, why is driving more alternative solutions in that direction because of that? I mean, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, it really comes down to three things. I mean, companies need to pursue whatever it is that is going to help them grow and really maintain their brand promise and the promise that they make to their customers, whoever those are. So if I'm a media company and I'm thinking about, how do I evolve with the current streaming, ecosystem of providers and technologies? How do I start harnessing things like AI to provide people with customization and what they might be watching using my platform? And how do I differentiate myself from other people? A lot of it comes down to data and how I move data around. If I'm a retailer, it's similar. I'm going to go into hyper personalization. I need to make my experiences fast. I need to be able to provide really that bespoke experience that shoppers expect to become loyal, users of my platform or brand advocates for me. And that really has a lot to do with technology and data and the intersection of AI and mobile. And even if I'm in, sort of a heavily regulated industry that some people might consider to be a laggard from a technology perspective. I mean, I grew up in Ohio in the Midwest. We are the server farms and the AS400s for the insurance business, right? Like that's what people built out in the flatlands that I grew up in. But, there is a need for people to start thinking about even for insurance and warranties and some of these businesses that maybe people don't always think about being on the bleeding edge. How do I think about mitigating risk for my users, but providing them with that sort of experience that they've come to expect in every other aspect of their lives, and now they want it from me? We've seen advancements in the way that you engage with an insurance company. Progressive was spearheading a lot of things with a mobile app. You get in an accident, you can send your pictures and upload things there. Now there's AI assistants to help you progress different things about your policy or about a claim that you might have. So there's a lot of intersection there. The problem that most companies are facing is as they move to the cloud, people got super excited because it allowed them to scale, they maintain high performance, and it was supposed to be inherently secure. That's true. And a lot of companies have realized those benefits. However, there was a cost to realizing those benefits. And it's not just a financial cost, but of course, it's also a financial cost. But part of it is there's gravity around these clouds that you use. And so if I think about, my The easiest path to building out a new application might be to use Amazon Web Services. There's so many developers that know it. They've got hundreds of services that they can provide. Every consulting firm, every chat space that talks about technology, people know AWS. But once I start putting my data on their platform, and then I think, well, maybe for this use case or for this microservice, or maybe as I expand it into a new market, I'd like to use another cloud provider, either because they help me maintain data sovereignty or compliance. Maybe there's a price incentive in a certain region, or I can just get closer to my users. There's now a cost for me to bring my data off of that platform or to share it on another cloud. And that sort of thing has started the regulators really thinking about, okay, you wanted to use this cloud to achieve your business objective. You wanted to have choice and flexibility as you evolved your business. And now you've really got to think as that third driver, what is the ultimate total cost of me making a change or basically evolving my architecture? And it blew up a little bit last year where we heard about egress fees and what
Yes.
some of the cloud providers did to try to help with those egress fees. But that is sort of the progression that people think about is they think about why they might use the cloud. They start to actually leverage the cloud, and then they think ultimately like, how will I grow? And the regulators are saying that last piece is starting to become unnecessarily difficult for
Mhm.
users to work through or for businesses to really work through.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on, actually, you gave me a little bit of a heartburns working with the AS400 back in the days because I used to have to design and install token ring networks back then, and people aren't in the business, don't even know what that is, right?
That's right.
From that point of view. But I think the part on egress cost is something that, a lot of people made mistakes from an enterprise perspective. Now, touching on that, right, from your view, what are the key vulnerabilities in the traditional cloud solutions and how are enterprise adapting in response to that?
So I think, if we start off with compliance, because it makes the news cycle an awful lot, there's a challenge when you think about how am I going to comply with things like data privacy laws? That's something that a lot of people have heard about. They've heard about GDPR or CCPA, or, you can pick, different sort of frameworks that people need to adhere to for different reasons. But one of the things that they all call for is you've got to understand what data you're managing for your users, how you're actually securing it, and where you're processing and storing that information. And that's hard. That's hard for any enterprise to do, even on-prem, let alone when you're working across a multi-cloud or a hybrid architecture. The challenge when you start thinking about doing it in the cloud context is when people started creating the reference architectures for cloud, and we started thinking about microservices and messaging. One of the things that you would think about is I have some central services and I have some distributed services. The central services might be things like all of my data will go through a broker that I'll deploy in fewer locations because all it's doing is processing and routing requests. And then I'll actually work on and store the data somewhere else. Well, the problem with that approach, as common as it is it starts to violate privacy statutes because now I've got data leaving the country where it was created or where the person originated, providing me with that data. So that creates a need to change an architecture. Now you think, okay, well, then make the change. I mean, these cloud providers are investing billions, tens of billions of dollars. We've got, nuclear reactors that are getting spun up now to start providing the energy that's required for these data centers. But it's not that easy for a company to think about how will I comply with that on a hyperscaler platform, because the second problem they have to face is where does my app scale and where do I run up my costs? So if I think about, what happens in that prior scenario in the case of a retail app, if I'm a retailer and I'm processing any request for transactions through a central service, and now I say, well, now if I'm getting private data from my user in France, then I've got to maintain that data within the confines of France. Well, now I've got to think if I create a copy of these services and now I'm running a bunch of information locally in France, locally in Germany, locally in Brazil, locally in other places where we have privacy laws. How much more does that cost me? Do I understand it? Do I have a way of anticipating that cost? Some of the analysts are starting to realize, and the regulators are starting to realize the answer is no. I can't really understand what those costs are. And then if I just think, that one extra step of like, well, now I want to make a change. I'd like to take this data that needs to be private and deploy it in a different way. Either I work with a regional cloud provider, maybe I would do some colo space and run something in my own sort of leased or own data center presence in that area. I have to pay a tax to get my data out. And then how often do I have to pay that tax? Like, is my data updated multiple times a day, multiple times an hour? Is it something that, AS400s were a different world when we used to work on them because you sort of created something and it could stay there into perpetuity. If I'm a retailer, it's a lot different than if I'm an actuary working at an insurance company because my actuarial tables don't change that frequently. If I'm a retailer, my cost, my supply chain, my inventory changes constantly. And so the cost of that change is an unfair tax that I have to pay to the hyperscalers. And then I think where the real friction started to occur was when you start looking at how the hyperscalers were both providing incentives to use and grow the use of their platforms with things like discounting, longer term commits to get better price performance, but then thinking about if somebody wanted to compete with you or somebody wanted to provide an alternative to your platform and a business wanted to take advantage of that alternative, now it threatens my commit because if I move data away, I might not hit my commit thresholds. It threatens me from a total cost of ownership perspective and a cost of goods perspective because now I've got to start paying every time I move my data off of the platform for those egress fees that are inherent in it. But worse than that, if I have to sync data back and forth, now I have to start thinking about, well, where am I going to incur the most or the least cost? And so the hyperscalers will come and look at somebody and say, don't worry, I'll provide you with aggressive discounting so that you don't have to worry about making that change. And when you roll those things together, the commits, the services that are proprietary and can't move, and then the aggressive discounting strategies, we've got regulators paying attention to that and saying that feels anti-competitive.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because when we look at some of these stricter regulations, do you feel that kind of this is accelerating the distributed cloud model? Since you talked about, these businesses looking to localize their infrastructure and stuff like that.
I think it is. I think it's changing the industry a bit because people are starting to say, I am being required to, but I also want the flexibility to manage the data and manage my applications where it makes the most sense for my business and my users. If I'm a gaming company, if I'm a streaming media company, if I'm a social company, if I'm an insurance company, it doesn't really matter. Every industry is going to start thinking, what's the best way for me to serve my constituents and my shareholders? And in some cases, it means that some of my data should always remain on-prem. In some cases, it would be I can have it in a hybrid environment because I'm a critical service provider and I need to be resilient against cyber threats. So I need a failover capability that will provide me with flexibility, but also consistency of service. And so if I start thinking about those constraints in a centralized hyperscaler model, the problem is I don't have that flexibility. I can't always choose to put something on-prem and in the cloud, or I can't choose to run things across the different clouds where I might get the best, price performance or the best return on investment because there's penalties that I'll pay for that flexibility. And so where we're seeing hyperscalers also adopt distributed cloud, I think it's in response to the regulatory environment, some of the constraints that are being put on. It's down to certain industries like financial services, like healthcare, in some cases, some manufacturing, certainly government entities and military entities where they'll say, like, I can't put my data into a public cloud environment, but I could maybe use private cloud and, on-prem data centers. And you need to give me the flexibility to take advantage of that. But it can also come from I have users that are constantly going to tell me I have the right to be forgotten, or I want to understand how you're using my data, and I need visibility into that data all the time. And where the regulatory environment, where the IP protection is required for certain industries, and also where users really want to have tight control over what you're doing with their data, all of those are use cases where I need that flexibility, I need that choice, and frankly, I need the cost performance to be something where I can afford to do this for my business in a way that still allows me to grow as a business and provide a better service to my users.
Yeah, no, that actually makes sense. I mean, and given that, right, like when we look at AI, right, one of the things people are realizing it's AI requires kind of like the real time and low latency, and it's a big demand. A lot of these customers are finding out. But how does adapting a distributed cloud infrastructure help those companies? And kind of like a competitive landscape there, would you say?
Well, I think the first thing that's really important is that the world is still figuring. I mean, AI is like cloud was. It's like, I mean, there have been
Yeah,
instances of
yeah.
this over time, right, where everything gets washed. So it's like now AI washing is rampant, just like, a decade ago, cloud washing was rampant. But if we really think about the investment and where we are going with AI, there is a need to build and train a model. Now,
Mhm.
most businesses are experimenting somehow with that process, but where Akamai has conviction and where I think we're also seeing the analyst community start to also publish their own research as they engage with enterprises, just like Akamai does, is most companies will ultimately leverage a commercially available model because it's too cost prohibitive, both from a skills perspective, a time perspective, but also just the sheer amount of data and infrastructure, and colo space that is required to build and train a large language model from scratch. So people will start to use off-the-shelf models. The lack of availability of infrastructure, like how hard it's been to get access to GPUs, the cost of renting GPUs for large swaths of time or to plan ahead for scalability events, can also be prohibitive for businesses. And so what we're starting to see is the real benefit to a lot of these companies is really in AI inference. It's being able to take a fine-tuned version of a model, a subset of that data, and say, the whole thing about AI is fast if it is trained to do a specific job. If it's a general sort of a framework, like if you think about ChatGPT and GPT-4, or if you like to engage with some of the other models out there, like Claude is another example. But sometimes you'll ask the AI a question, and users will look at the way that the information is presented on a screen and say, "Oh, that's kind of cool. It's kind of engaging, like it's typing it out for me." But the reality is, it's hiding the fact that you asked a question of a very broad model, and it takes time to actually process that data and to give you an answer. Well, if I'm a retailer, or if I'm, take something even easier. We saw examples of food companies trying to apply this in drive-through
Mm,
context, right?
true.
You drive up to a drive-through, you tell the speaker what you want. You don't want it to process and like start to show you a list. You just want it to say it's going to be $5. Please pull around to window two, and you keep moving. But if you don't have a fine-tuned model, you're not going to get that quick answer. So what we're seeing with distributed cloud and what we're starting to understand as sort of the pinch points of recognizing the benefits of AI inference and agentic AI is as businesses shift to say, these are the sorts of implementations that actually provide me a benefit. I can have a chatbot. I can ask it questions and get very quick answers that are personalized to my users. There's something that can help somebody make a decision in a co-pilot sort of a fashion. Those rely on very like well-trained, fine-tuned models that are a subset of an LLM. They need to be placed closer to where the user is going to be engaging with them because the data is getting created at the edge or at least further away from the core. And then all of the questions and answers need to happen there. They can't go back to a central model. It can't go back to a large language model. It needs to go to a fine-tuned model. And that data needs to move between where it's stored, where it's processed across a data fabric, and then ultimately where CPU and GPU power is put against it in that environment. And that needs to be put closer to a user. The other constraint that you have, other than the proximity, is the throughput. You need pipes that can basically move that data very, very quickly. The hyperscaler platforms that are excellent for building and training a large language model are excellent for it because they have that capacity that can scale slowly and infinitely, but also because there isn't that need for the throughput and the low latency that distributed cloud is addressing. Because if you think about training that model, you can take all the time you want. If you think
Right.
about somebody asking a question of the model and expecting a response, they want, 50 millisecond response times. That requires that throughput and that proximity. That's where we're starting to see people really appreciate that distributed cloud architecture because it allows them to realize those benefits using what they know of cloud native development to build the applications themselves.
Yeah, it's you touched on something which is a good point regarding, like, say, a retail, right? I mean, I can't imagine waiting during, holiday season or something, waiting for those tax to go through. So it's an important point. Now, since you touched on retail, right, as being a vertical or an industry, right, AI at the edge is kind of affecting, right? Are there any other industries or verticals that you feel, AI at the edge is going to be important to? Because the retail was a really good example because I could envision that how bad that would be in a holiday. Any ones that come to the top of your mind just for our audience there?
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing, you think about IoT,
Yeah.
which could mean anything, right? So you
Right, right,
you don't really need, for example, like agentic AI on a Ring doorbell camera. But
right.
think about other implementations of IoT, like your connected vehicle. Like there is something happening in most people's cars today, if they were built, let's say, from 2017 forward, where it's actually fascinating for somebody like me that grew up like working on old cars in the garage, because again, Ohio. But
Yeah.
if you think about what's happening now, like people are really judging their cars based on the infotainment system and based on what that experience and how connected it is with an app. And if I go and charge or buy gas if I'm not using an electric vehicle, like I want something that is making my life more seamless and easier. That is an IoT use case. It's also a distributed or an edge use case because you've got sparsely connected IoT devices, the cars. They're going to move from cell tower to cell tower, Wi-Fi networks when they're parked in your garage or apartment or whatever. There are things there that are constantly changing from a network connectivity and then therefore a throughput perspective. You've also got periods where it's offline but still has to process. So you need something to be done on the actual like physical device itself. And then there needs to be that synchronization as things, connect back up, you download firmware updates. There are a lot of things that need to process. Now, where AI comes into play is if I'm driving, increasingly people are not willing to kind of laugh off, I talked to my car and it completely misunderstood me. That used to be a joke for anybody who likes Top Gear. I love Top Gear, but like that was always, a joke. Jeremy Clarkson would try to talk to a car and then get super frustrated because it didn't understand him. That's not viable today. Like consumers will not tolerate that experience in their vehicles anymore, and they're making buying decisions based off of it. So now we need to make sure that we're always sending the right telemetry, that we're downloading the latest firmware updates, but then also we're providing people with that seamless experience when they're driving around in their vehicles. Take another example that people might not think about, but if you travel and you go to like a hotel, a lot of the hotels are now starting to say, mobile check-in, you'll get your mobile key. Okay, that's really simple. But what about other things? I'm a Marriott Bonvoy member. I always go to Marriott properties. There's a way that they are starting to think about in the hotel industry. Is there a way that you like your room? Do you like your lights a certain way? Do you want the curtains to open and close at a certain point in time? Do you want to connect your favorite streaming, channels to the television that's in there? Should we be ordering you certain food when you get close and we think about proximity on your device? So there's a lot of AI that can work into understanding the property that I'm in, understanding the profile of the user that's engaging, and then understanding that user's preference. And then based on how they're engaging in real time, some of this is going to be heuristic decisioning, which has been happening for a long time. And people used to use AI, and then, technologists would eye roll and say, that's not AI, that's simpler. But increasingly, you add on top of that, I want to engage with that system and I want it to take cues from me and take the appropriate action. And so a lot of the things that we used to think about as sort of very manual, very like hands-on, experiences are now having to become not just automated in a way where it happens and you're either surprised or horrified that it happened by itself, but magical in the sense of like, I can't believe I'm interacting with my room and my room is doing what I would expect it to do as if somebody were going around and doing these things for me, but they're doing it at my direction versus where I think the industry was, 5 to 7 years ago, which is let us understand what you typically do and then we'll do it for you. Because consumers said, we don't like that. And so this whole interactivity, I think, is what are driving these shifts. Because it was one thing when we said, we'll just collect data about you, we'll use that data, and then we'll put it to work. Now it's we'll have it ready to go to work, but it's going to wait until you engage with it. And that requires, again, that really high throughput to manage the data and low latency to make the reality occur quickly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think of a lot of enterprise, even service providers have realized the importance of the value of that customer experience, right? Their ARPU increases, their profit margins increase, and their lifetime value of the customer, like you said, with the Marriott experience is a perfect example. Now, being a former CTO, when we talk about this multi-cloud edge that, I'm a little, how do you address kind of like the data management, particularly around the API and some of these security challenges when we look at this environment?
I think one design pattern that we're starting to see emerge very strongly is application developers want to use a platform to develop on top of. Now, there's different approaches that you can take for that, right? Like you could say, I am always going to build in open source platforms. I'll use, Linux, I'll use Kubernetes, I'll use, open source, free open source technology because that way I won't be locked in. I believe in the contribution by everybody, the rising tide lifts all boats sort of thing. But we can advance technology faster if we get the best and the brightest globally all participating and advancing something consistently. I mean, that's been the magic of Linux and the Linux kernel and how it's evolved, over decades. So that's sort of one approach that people are taking, saying like, if I maintain open standards and open source technology, then I will always be able to port that from one cloud to another. I might not be able to take advantage of specialized services, but I'll have the freedom and the flexibility to move things around. Related, and I touched on it, is Kubernetes. People thinking about containerized environments. There's a growing understanding that as we deploy containerized applications, that the scaling is harder than people maybe originally would have thought, or maybe didn't really understand until they got to those scaling events. And so you're seeing investments in application platforms that take the toil out of actually scaling these Kubernetes platforms. But container registries are sort of the new API, so to speak, for how applications can move from cloud to cloud or scale from, let's say a public cloud to a private cloud, depending on what the use case or what the data scaling activity may be. So that portability and that focus on here's where Kubernetes or Docker or some of these other containerized environments can really help me to maintain that flexibility and that growth without feeling the lock-in experience. All the things about egress still apply, and those are still challenging, but at least I'm not getting locked into a vendor's interpretation of something if I use Kubernetes versus, the version of it that AWS built or the version of it that Azure built. And then, those things I think are relevant, but it's also where we're starting to see low code systems really gain traction. So now we're seeing developers that used to code in JavaScript or Django, or, they looked at things where it was primarily lightweight front end coding that they were doing. And they want to apply that same sort of an approach to more robust cloud architectures. So if we think about, addressing containers, we've got companies like Fermion that have the WASM cloud as the open source version of what they develop. But like that is based on WebAssembly coding on a containerized platform that can scale and leverage with infrastructure as a service components, but you're abstracting away understanding that underpinning. And you're really just focusing on WebAssembly. So, you go from the more complicated versions of it, if I just want to use free open source, and there's a lot of toil and a lot of tooling. You go into containerized environments that gives me more repeatability. Maybe I can scale faster and realize value more quickly. Or there you go even more abstract and say, I'd rather work just in a platform as a service with serverless functions where I'm using WebAssembly. And that's sort of the lightest weight way to do it. But in all cases, there's trade-offs for, on the extreme end of the development, I have full control over everything that I'm doing, all the scaling events, all of the choice of what is powering my application. On the other extreme, I can probably get to market a hell of a lot faster, but I don't always have full control or full choice over what's happening underneath it. And depending on, the developers that you can attract and maintain at your business, the type of business that you are, different companies will make different choices. For example, like if I'm building the next generation streaming platform or gaming platform, I may choose more of that full control because my margins are so low and I really need to keep tight control over anything that might cost me, an extra penny here, an extra penny there. If I think about it on the opposite extreme, if I'm in the real estate business, surprisingly competitive industry where they're actually using AI very effectively because you can do a lot more with a platform like Zillow than just see who has recently bought or sold a home or how I want to plan my weekend for open houses. You can also start to understand the dynamics of the housing market in a given region. You can start to do urban planning or think about like how might I want to think about where I would put the next headquarters for my office or the extension satellite branch of my office based on where I can attract talent, where I can have my employees live and commute to work more easily. There's so much that can go into those platforms, but if you think about who is building the application, that low to no code platform allows them to do a lot more. And then it's the connectivity through APIs to draw from existing data sources that's where the real magic occurs. It's the intellectual property, it's not the infrastructure. And so in those cases, that low code is actually really beneficial in an industry like real estate because they can create all of these derivatives quickly and ensure a great user experience.
Yeah, no, this is very impactful. I mean, and good insight. Maybe if you don't mind, we can close with, I mean, getting, because you touched on a few advanced management tools and stuff like that for our audience, which is a variety of network engineers, IT, and cloud providers. If we look forward at 2025, just to add on to some of the things you touched on, what are the new IT skills, advanced management tools that you think will be critical for our audience when you look at the changing cloud landscape?
Well, I mean, I'll probably a little bit biased. So, when
Okay.
back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was part of a startup by accident that created the first online insurance quoting engine. That was really where I discovered, front end coding, back end coding, middleware coding, and I got really passionate about databases.
Mhm.
So that's coloring a little bit of the way that I think, but I think data management skills are really critical right now to harness the power and potential of AI. It's also going to help companies, maintain compliance, think about cyber resilience, but also think about distributed apps and distributed computing. I mean, in 2025, if I'm a retailer trying to reach new markets, potentially work around tariffs, if that becomes a thing, I mean, there's all sorts of uncertainty in the political landscape right now. One thing that's common, people still go online and they still want to buy things. And I want to make sure that I'm giving them that experience as easily as possible. The interesting thing about it now, though, is if I think about scaling my inventory, like one really interesting data management challenge is if I've got my inventory of goods as anybody other than, say, Amazon, then I probably have my inventory managed in a central location, but I'm branching out as a global audience of customers that I want to maintain loyalty for on my platform. Well, I want to give all of them insight into my inventory. I might have an upcoming event like, this weekend in the United States, we have the Super Bowl. There's other events like that globally, whether it's the Premier League soccer tournaments or in some cases, it might be tied to, other sports, pick your poison. But either way, like you've got a lot of people coming in that want to buy merchandise, that want to buy, whatever goods you're promoting. If I want to manage that inventory at a global scale, I can't wait for a distributed data problem of being eventually consistent and updating it. People don't want to put something in their cart and go to checkout and realize that somebody sold out of inventory. Those data management skills and distributed data management to enable something as simple as I just want to buy your promotional item is starting to become a distributed computing use case and challenge that people are looking for expertise in. So the old curmudgeon DBAs that used to be all worried about, I need indexing, I need backup, I need this, I need that, and there's all sorts of reasons why your application can't do what you want it to do, are now the people who are saying, I have the skills and the understanding to enable you to manage this problem at scale. Now that data management challenge dovetails with network management challenges. We also in 2025 are going to see people's skills who understand how to push basically a lot of data over networks become more and more in demand because that is going to be the new choke point for
Right.
applications and for AI. It's not, do I have access to GPUs to do the processing? It's, do I have the pipes to push the data back and forth so
Right.
that I can drive the lighter weight inference and agentic use cases closer to my users? So databases and networking should see a renaissance of interest in those disciplines where companies are really going to be looking for people who are experts in those areas. I think the other one, obviously, with everything going on around AI, we're going to see a lot more specialization start to come out in AI. There will be people who will be expert in thinking about how to train that large language model, how to scale it, what is required for the body of knowledge that your company will take advantage of. But there's also going to be a need for the people who know how to do the fine tuning and how to adapt that AI then for various use cases that the business will monetize with and use to create loyal customers and drive up their net promoter scores and other, aligned loyalty metrics. And that's really like the cutting edge stuff, but it's going to really borrow from people that understand things like data warehousing, data analytics, query dynamics, people who are experts in not SQL because SQL is going to be the language of AI, but people who
Right.
understand how to construct queries and make those,
Right.
execute very, very quickly. And they'll be able to apply the cloud native um, skills that they've built up in those architectures, but they'll turn into edge native. And that's probably the last thing that I think we'll see, other than the regulatory environment
Right.
heating up and all of that, which I think is a byproduct. But
Mhm.
what we'll start to see sort of on that front is as we're building out the applications and as people are really thinking about like how do I scale them, how do I secure them, how do I make them performant, you've got the data management, you've got the throughput, you've got the people who are thinking about building the model, and then the next question after that is going to be like how are we going to make it from a user experience perspective as seamless as humanly possible.
Right.
And that user experience engineering and people really thinking about the best way to engage and keep a user engaged throughout their life cycle
Right.
is the last thing that I think we'll really see heating up quite a bit because net dollar retention for any SaaS business, and most businesses are starting to trend more in a SaaS direction for how
Mhm.
people consume them. I mean, hell, even cars are starting to introduce, like Volvo has done, a
Right.
subscription model as opposed to a lease or a buy model.
Right.
That is the next thing is like how do I maintain net dollar retention for my users with all of these other challenges that I'm dealing with data and architecture. And that's where I think this year we'll see a sort of a resurgence in what's old is new and what
Right.
people sort of took for granted 5 to 7 years ago becoming very, top of mind as these new experiences are developed.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, and for our European audience, when he said Premier League, he meant to say football, not
I
soccer.
did. That's correct.
Yeah,
That's
Ari, I
correct.
really appreciate it. It was a very insightful discussion. Thanks for doing that. Now, for our audience, we're going to distribute this in a video and then put it on all the social media and all the different podcast platform. So with Ari, this is Ray Mota. Thanks for joining this podcast.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, everybody.